My mother is no longer capable of managing her own money. The sentence cut through the quiet hum of the bank like a blade. I froze mid-step, my hand still on the glass door, and the chill of the brass handle sank into my skin. That voice, it was my son's, Marlon. I took a slow breath and stepped inside, keeping to the side of the lobby. He was seated across from the branch manager at her polished desk, leaning forward in his chair as though sharing a simple, undeniable truth. His tone was calm, almost bored, like this was just business. "I'm worried about her," he continued smoothly. "She's been making questionable decisions lately." My chest tightened. I'd come here for something so ordinary, to withdraw a bit of cash for a new coffee grinder. Instead, I was rooted to the floor, listening to my own son dismantle my competence in front of a stranger. The manager, a woman in her 40s with a clipped bob, nodded sympathetically. Marlon reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a slim folder, sliding it across the desk. "This," he said, "is the paperwork granting me authority to manage her finances. I thought it would be best to make it official before anything irreversible happens." He spoke with such ease that had I been anyone else, I might have believed him. But I wasn't anyone else. I was his mother, the woman who taught him how to balance a checkbook, who helped him cover the down payment for his first home. I forced my breathing to steady, pressing my shoulder against a marble pillar for cover. From here, I could see the edge of the folder, the crisp white of legal documents inside. My instincts told me this wasn't just a conversation. It was a transaction in the making. The manager began flipping through the pages. Marlon sat back, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest, confident. Too confident. I stayed where I was, every sense sharpened. If I moved too soon, I'd lose my chance to see what he was doing. So I waited silent and let him talk. From my corner, I could hear the rhythm of his voice, smooth and convincing. Every sentence he spoke sounded rehearsed, as if he'd practiced it in front of a mirror. The words "power of attorney" drifted over the desk, followed by immediate transfer. I gripped the strap of my handbag tighter. Power of attorney, immediate transfer. My life, everything I'd built, was not a set of accounts to be passed around like spare change. For as long as I can remember, I've kept my affairs in perfect order. My house in Rutledge has an entire room lined with oak cabinets, each drawer labeled and organized property deeds, bank statements, my will, all signed in my own steady hand. Even my late husband's pension records are tucked neatly into a blue folder, the ink still dark despite the years. I thought of all the nights I'd stayed up balancing the books, the decades of discipline. I thought of Marlon as a boy perched at the kitchen table while I showed him how to save his allowance in a glass jar. That memory used to make me smile. Now it just left an ache behind my ribs. The manager's pen scratched against paper as she made notes. Marlon leaned forward again, lowering his voice just enough to sound confidential. "I'm just trying to protect her before it's too late." I knew I couldn't interrupt. Not yet. Confronting him here would only tip my hand. I needed to know exactly what he had in that folder. From my position, I could see the faint shimmer of a notary stamp pressed into one of the pages. My eyes narrowed. I'd never signed anything in front of a notary without logging it in my files. The fact that this was here in the bank's possession, without my knowledge, it burned like acid in my chest. I kept my gaze on him, memorizing every movement, every inflection, letting the details carve themselves into my mind. If he was going to rewrite my life on paper, I would be ready to rewrite the ending. The manager excused herself to make a copy, and that was when I stepped forward. The moment the manager stepped into the back, Marlon's phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen, muttered something under his breath, and stood. For the first time since I'd walked in the chair across from the desk, sat empty, the thin folder still resting exactly where he'd left it. My pulse quickened. I didn't move at first, just listened to the muffled sound of his voice beyond the glass, then stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The top page stared back at me, my name printed in bold, followed by a signature that mimicked mine poorly. The slant was too sharp, the loops too tight. I'd signed enough documents in my lifetime to know my own hand, and this wasn't it. Across the header in block letters read, "Power of Attorney." The text below gave Marlon full authority over all financial, legal, and property matters effective immediately. My stomach knotted. I let my gaze drift lower. The notary stamp was smudged, missing the crisp, embossed seal it should have had. 2 witness names sat in tidy type strangers to me, with addresses in a city I'd never even visited. Every detail screamed forgery. Years of working in the library had trained my eyes to take in and store information fast. I scanned the date, the notary number, the witness names, burning them into memory before stepping back to where I'd been standing. Through the glass doors, Marlon was still pacing, phone to his ear, unaware. I returned to my corner, steadying my breath, just as he re-entered the lobby and slipped back into his seat. By the time the manager returned with a manila envelope, I'd already decided I wouldn't confront him here. Not yet. This wasn't just a matter of trust anymore, it was a matter for the law. I turned and left quietly, my mind locked on what I'd just seen and the proof I would need next. Back home, I locked the door behind me and went straight to the oak cabinet in my study. The familiar scent of polished wood and paper grounded me. I opened the top drawer, sliding out the neatly labeled folders, property deed, bank accounts, insurance, my will. Each page carried my real signature, written in my steady hand. I compared them in my mind to the hurried, tight script I'd seen at the bank. The difference was undeniable. I set the folders on the desk, then reached for the phone. My fingers hesitated for a moment over the keypad before dialing Mirabelle Kinsrow. She had been my attorney for nearly 20 years, through the purchase of my home, the settlement of my husband's estate, even a minor zoning dispute with the town. She knew my habits, and she knew my mind was as sharp as ever. "Verelda." She answered, her voice low but warm. "I need your help," I said. And then I told her everything, what I'd heard, what I'd seen, and what I suspected. I could almost feel her pause on the other end when I mentioned the forged signature. "That's serious," she said finally. "You need a copy of those documents, and you need to act as if you don't know they exist." We discussed the steps. I would return to the bank in a few days, request the paperwork under the pretense of an annual review for my own files. Meanwhile, she would prepare to involve the fraud division, and if necessary, law enforcement. Her calm steadied me. This was no longer about hurt feelings. It was about evidence, timing, and the law. After we hung up, I gathered the original documents and placed them back in the cabinet, turning the key until the lock clicked. My gaze lingered on the brass handle. Everything in that cabinet represented my life's work, and I wasn't about to let anyone take it from me. I closed the study door and walked into the kitchen, the plan already arranging itself in my mind. All I needed now was patience and the right moment to make my move. 2 days later, I walked into the bank dressed in my most unremarkable clothes, loafers, a beige cardigan, no jewelry, but my wedding band. I carried a slim folder under my arm, as if I were there for nothing more than routine errands. The same branch manager greeted me with a practiced smile. "Mrs. Carrington, how can I help you today? I'm updating my personal files," I said, keeping my tone light. "I'd like copies of any documents you have on record for my accounts, signatures, authorizations, the works. I like to keep everything together." She didn't hesitate. Within minutes, she returned with a neatly clipped stack of papers. I thanked her, slid them into my folder without looking, and made polite conversation about the weather until I was out the door. Only when I was seated at my kitchen table did I open the folder. There it was, the same power of attorney I'd glimpsed before, complete with the false signature, fabricated witnesses, and flawed notary stamp. I flipped through the rest of the pages, noting dates, transaction requests, and language that gave Marlon sweeping control over my finances. Every line confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't carelessness. It was deliberate. I spread the documents across the table, photographed each one, and sent the images to Mirabelle with a short message. "We have it." Her reply came within minutes. "This is enough. I'll contact the fraud division today." I gathered the originals, slipped them back into the folder, and locked them in my cabinet. A strange calm settled over me. The anger was still there, but it had crystallized into something sharper focus. For the first time since that morning at the bank, I felt the balance tip ever so slightly back in my favor. The evidence was no longer just in my memory. It was in black and white, impossible to dispute. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, hands wrapped around the warm mug, picturing the next steps. Somewhere out there, Marlon still believed he was ahead. That illusion wouldn't last much longer. By the following afternoon, Mirabelle had looped in the bank's fraud department. She called me from her office, her voice carrying that crisp edge she used when the law was on her side. "They've reviewed the documents, Virelda. The notary stamp alone is enough to raise alarms. I've recommended they place a hold on any transactions tied to Marlon until the investigation concludes." I thanked her, though. The words felt too small for what she'd just done. That hold meant he couldn't siphon a cent, not without drawing immediate attention. The next morning, I received the first sign it was working. My phone chimed with an alert from the bank. "Failed online withdrawal attempt. Account locked pending verification." I stared at the message, imagining Marlon sitting at his desk, confusion tightening into frustration as the system refused him access. I didn't call. I didn't text. Silence was the cleanest weapon I had. The less he knew about what I was doing, the more his own uncertainty would work against him. Later that day, Mirabelle informed me she'd forwarded everything to the state's financial crimes unit. The case had been assigned to an investigator named Rylan Cross, a man she described as methodical and relentless. When he called that evening, his questions were direct, his tone firm, but not unkind. "I'll need to confirm your mental and physical capacity," he said. "Standard procedure in elder fraud cases." "Of course," I replied, and we set a date for the following week. His calm professionalism reassured me this was no longer just me against Marlon. I had the law on my side now, and the law was paying attention. As the call ended, I walked to the window looking out over the quiet street. The house felt steady around me, the walls holding in a lifetime's worth of order and security. And yet, beneath that stillness, the first movements of something bigger were underway, like the low rumble before a storm. When the time came, the confrontation wouldn't be mine to start. It would begin in a place Marlon couldn't control. Detective Cross called early the next morning. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it. "Be at the bank at 9 tomorrow. Don't approach him. Just be present." I arrived a few minutes before the hour, taking a seat in a corner of the lobby where I had a clear view of the entrance. My heart kept an even pace steady, in a way I hadn't expected. The past weeks had been about gathering, protecting, and waiting. Now it seemed waiting was about to end. Marlon walked in at exactly 9, wearing a tailored gray suit, and that easy smile he used when he wanted something. He greeted the branch manager as though they were old friends and took the same seat I'd seen him in before. From across the room, I watched him produce a withdrawal slip, sliding it across the desk with quiet confidence. The manager excused herself, stepping into the back. For a few seconds, the air in the room felt almost still. Then the glass doors opened, and 2 uniformed officers entered. Their steps were measured, their expressions unreadable. One of them spoke first, his voice carrying just enough to be heard across the lobby. "Marlon Carrington, you're under arrest for forgery fraud and attempted financial exploitation." I watched his shoulders stiffen. His head turned sharply, eyes scanning the room until they found me. For a moment, neither of us moved. I kept my expression neutral, my hands folded in my lap. The officers read him his rights, cuffed him, and guided him toward the exit. As they passed, I could see the flicker of disbelief in his eyes, the moment he understood this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the result of choices he had made. When the doors closed behind them, the lobby returned to its usual quiet hum. I rose from my seat, the weight in my chest, lifting just enough to let in a long, slow breath. By the time I stepped outside, the squad car was already pulling away, and I knew the next time I saw him would be in a courtroom. The courthouse smelled faintly of varnish and paper, a mix that reminded me of the library where I'd worked for years. I sat in the second row behind the prosecution's table, my hands resting on the smooth wood of the bench. Mirabelle sat beside me, her presence steady and unyielding. Marlon was led in, wearing the same gray suit I'd seen at the bank, though now it hung slightly looser, the sharp creases gone. He avoided my eyes, focusing instead on the defense attorney at his side. I couldn't tell if it was shame or stubbornness that kept his gaze from meeting mine. The prosecutor laid out the case with measured precision. Copies of the forged documents were entered into evidence, each detail projected onto the courtroom screen. I watched the judge's brow tighten at the sight of the flawed notary, stamp the false witness names. My real signature, pulled from years of legal documents, was displayed alongside the forgery, a silent but irrefutable comparison. When it was my turn to testify, I kept my voice calm, sticking to the facts, how I discovered the documents, the photographs I took, the steps I followed to secure the originals. I didn't speak about the years of sacrifices or the personal betrayal. This was not the place for sentiment. It was about truth. Marlon's attorney tried to suggest I might have been confused that age could affect memory. But the prosecutor countered with my meticulous records, my recent cognitive evaluation, and the testimony of the bank's fraud investigator. The defense's argument crumbled quickly. By the end of the day, the judge's verdict was clear guilty on all counts. Sentencing would follow in 2 weeks, but the conviction alone was enough to release the air I'd been holding for months. As the bailiff led Marlon away, he glanced over his shoulder for the briefest moment. Our eyes met, and in his, I saw something new, an awareness that this was no longer just between mother and son. When I left the courthouse, the weight I carried felt lighter, though I knew the story was not yet over. 2 weeks later, I returned to the courthouse for sentencing. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows, throwing thin beams of light across the polished floor. I sat in the same place as before, Mirabelle beside me, her legal pad resting untouched on her lap. Marlon entered, flanked by deputies, his suit now exchanged for the pale orange of the county jail. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders drawn and his eyes fixed on the ground. I tried to read his expression, but it was guarded, neither defiant nor apologetic, just distant. The judge reviewed the charges once more, his voice steady. Forgery, fraud, attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Each count felt like a nail hammered into the final shape of this moment. The prosecutor spoke briefly, noting the deliberate nature of the acts, the breach of trust, and the need for accountability. When invited to speak, Marlon rose slowly. His voice was low, almost flat. I didn't think it would get this far. I thought I could fix it before she knew. I was wrong. He didn't look at me. The judge's tone was firm, leaving no room for misinterpretation. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 3. You will also pay restitution for legal costs incurred by the victim. The gavel struck once sharp in the quiet room. The deputies moved to take him by the arms. This time, Marlon did glance toward me. His eyes held a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or the first stirrings of regret. But it was gone too quickly to catch. As they led him away, the sound of his chains was muffled by the thick carpet. I remained seated, my hands folded neatly in my lap, letting the stillness settle around me. When I finally stood, Mirabelle touched my arm, lightly. "It's done," she said. I nodded, though I knew that for me, it wasn't entirely done. There would still be the matter of what came next, the life I would lead without the shadow of his schemes hanging over me. 3 months after the sentencing, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. The return address was the state correctional facility. I stood on the porch for a moment, turning it over in my hands, the paper rough beneath my fingers. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper folded twice. The handwriting was his still neat, still deliberate. "Mother," it began. "I've had a lot of time to think. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I know I don't deserve it. I keep replaying the moment at the bank, wondering how I convinced myself it was the right thing to do. I see now it was greed, plain and simple. I told myself I was protecting you, but that was a lie I wanted to believe. His words were careful, but they carried a weight I hadn't heard from him in years. He wrote about the hours he spent in the prison library, the programs he'd joined, the quiet nights when regret pressed in like a second skin. I wish I could undo it. I can't. All I can do is serve my time and try to be a man you wouldn't be ashamed to call your son." I read it twice, then folded it back along its creases. The hurt was still there, but so was the sense that something in him had shifted. Whether it was enough to rebuild trust, I didn't know. Trust once broken is rebuilt in actions, not words, and his actions would take years to measure. I placed the letter in my desk drawer, not with the important documents, but not in the trash either. Some things needed to be kept, if only as reminders of what had been lost and what might still be found. Later that afternoon, I walked through my garden, the sun warming my shoulders. The air felt open, unburdened. The accounts were secure, the house was mine, and for the first time in months, there was no immediate battle to fight. I closed the gate behind me, feeling the quiet settle in and let myself breathe.